Hola surfistas, gracias por acompañarnos el día de hoy. I'm your host, Valeria Vega. Nailivers, golondrinos, bukelistas, focas. You've heard all these terms for stands of Latin America's self-proclaimed coolest dictator before. But where did Nayib Bukele come from? Was he an industry plant? Or did this girlie work his butt off to get to the tippity top? This episode looks at the rise of El Nabo, from his days as a media mogul, nightclub promoter, Yamaha dealer, and local mayor, to iconoclast president performing on monthly State of the Unions for his adoring fans. We talked to Hilary Goodfriend, a researcher at the UNAM-Mexico City and editor at Jacobin Magazine, NACLA, and Latin American Perspectives, who masterfully walks us through the branding, improvisation, and family connections that launched Nayib into the executive, and how a healthy dose of papitis, as well as class and racial resentment, may be what's driving the sweeping changes that El Salvador is experiencing today. Apologies for my raging cold in this episode, amics. Come with us as we explore the origins of the Clan Bukele all the way to the first crypto bro-in-chief of El Salvador. The water's warm, and this is live from Surf City.
Good afternoon, surfers. We are hanging 10 here with one of my favorite people in the world, researcher, writer extraordinaire, Hilary Goodfriend. Welcome to the show. Hilary, you are our very, very first non-Salvadoran guest, so this is going to be like a up against the wall kind of question. Why am I interviewing you specifically about Nayib Bukele's trajectory? Who are you? Why do you have a lot to say about this?
Well, I feel like that's a question you should answer first.
but if you ask me.
I came to live in and work on and in El Salvador and about El Salvador, mostly through my involvement with an international solidarity organization called CISPIS, the Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador. It has a long history of organizing in the United States against U.S. intervention in the region and in solidarity with popular movements for liberation. And through that work, I came to spend time in El Salvador. I ended up living in El Salvador for several years. I did my master's in El Salvador, and I met and sustained many friendships and relationships. You can hear my daughter in the background. That is one such relationship.
Okay, so it sounds like you have a pretty clear connection to the country, but when did Bukele start popping up on your radar as a, researcher, activist, whatever you want to call it?
Well, Bukele was around, right? Bukele was mayor of a small suburb of San Salvador where I lived in 2012. I believe he became mayor of Nuevo Cuscatlan with the FMLN, right? The leftist party that was in the presidency at the time. And in 2017, he made some waves because he was expelled from the FMLN by their ethics committee. Now, we can kind of rewind and talk about like who is Bukele, where does he come from, and like what brought him and the party to that point.
I would like to rewind, but if you want to finish your thought about why he got kicked out or what.
Just to say that moment was pretty significant, and he went on from there to sort of launch his individual presidential candidacy, right? That eventually brought him to win executive office in El Salvador in 2019, right? But I think that moment is really, really important in Bukele's trajectory and is what sort of like drew my attention, particularly to him, and the attention, I think, of other folks who were paying attention to politics in El Salvador.
So tell us a little bit about how this guy even started thinking about mayoral ambitions. Like, why even go for Nuevo Cuscatlan? And then obviously he just kept climbing. But let's think about him before he even had these kind of political ambitions.
Sure. I mean, I think what's important to say is that the FMLN is a political party in the sense of like political parties everywhere in the world except the United States, perhaps, right? So this is an organization with internal discipline, structure, and like militancias, that is to say like party memberships, right? So Bukele's candidacy was unusual in that he did not come up through the ranks of the FMLN, in its youth structures and like in neighborhood-based committees, which is sort of the typical trajectory of FMLN political candidates. The reason that Bukele has a relationship with the FMLN and had one in the first place is through his father, Armando Bukele. Armando Bukele was a really interesting person. He was this very important public intellectual in El Salvador. He wrote columns. He was a university. I don't know if he was a professor at the university, but he did important research, and he ran his own television show, but he was a businessman above all and belonged to this sort of broader class of merchants and sort of the commercial bourgeoisie in El Salvador and in Central America that are often referred to as the Turcos, the Turks, but this just means that they belong to this generation or rather his family belongs to this generation of migrants from what was the Ottoman Empire at the turn of the 1900s, right? Who came over, Jews, Muslims, Christians, they all came over at the same time. This merchant class became established in the region and generally all became very wealthy.
So we're talking about Syrians, Palestinians, Lebanese.
Very much so.
Okay.
And presumably Turks.
Presumably maybe Turks somewhere.
but mostly Lebanese and Palestinian
Yeah,
folks,
I've personally
honestly.
never met a Salvadoran Turk. I'm sure they exist, but
same. I think it's just the Ottoman thing, frankly. But yeah, so that is to say that Bukele's family was actually Christian Palestinians, but his father converted to Islam, and
I
actually
had no idea.
It's extremely strange.
I thought they were Muslim, forever.
They are.
Oh yeah.
Now.
Yeah, but I thought that from Ottoman times,
No. They were Christian Palestinians, and his father converted to Islam and proceeded to establish the Muslim community in El Salvador. He opened all the mosques that exist in El Salvador and ran them, and was interestingly polygamous in a way that is extremely controversial. Yes, he had multiple wives. That's partly why
In
there's
El
so many.
Salvador?
That's why there's so many Bukele brothers. They're and half siblings. Is because he has multiple wives, but not in series.
Right, at the same time.
Yeah.
Wow.
Very strange. Armando
what
Bukele.
an interesting guy.
Really a maverick.
Yeah,
We don't
truly.
talk enough about him. Much more
really
interesting than
don't.
any of his sons, frankly. And certainly a lot smarter.
Armando Bukele Catan held a PhD in industrial chemistry, as well as several other degrees in physics, history, and journalism, and was, I think, affiliated with the chemistry and physics department at the University of El Salvador, though I can't find too many details on this affiliation. He became a household name through his TV show, Aclarando Conceptos, which had Armando pontificating about various social and political topics for an hour each week. Armando fathered 10 children, 4 of them with Nayib's mother Olga. These 3 brothers, Karim, Yusuf, and Ibrahim, are the closest to Nayib and clearly holds a lot of decision-making power in the current administration. Armando Bukele passed away in 2015, at the beginning of Nayib's period as mayor of San Salvador.
So Armando's family, like I said, they're merchants, this sort of commercial bourgeoisie. They ran the first McDonald's franchise in El Salvador, and there's an interesting history there because they actually ended up suing McDonald's and winning, and McDonald's actually left El Salvador for several years.
What? Why?
I don't even remember what the heart of the dispute was, but they also ran the Yamaha franchise in El Salvador.
Okay, that was the one I did know.
Yeah, and that's important because the current Minister of Public Works worked at the Yamaha dealership that Bukele ran, and that's his sole experience.
Convenient.
And it shows. It shows. They had importantly a publicity, an advertising agency company, right? And so Bukele and that advertising agency, I should say, ran many of the FMLN's campaigns, political campaigns, electoral campaigns over the years. This is because Armando Bukele was very close with the FMLN. So he, like I said, he comes from this moneyed sector, this sort of up and coming commercial bourgeoisie, but they're not oligarchs. An interesting thing about this sort of class of the so-called Turcos in the region is that they don't come from the same landed, plantation class of the 14 families, quote unquote, right? That have been sort of the owners of El Salvador.
They're not the coffee people.
Exactly. They are not the coffee people. And they have been very much excluded from a lot of those sort of elite spaces in the country by just the racism of that like strata of the ruling class in El Salvador. It's interesting, Bukele studied at the Panamericana Colegio. That's like a fancy, expensive private school, bilingual private school in El Salvador, but it is not the top tier of the private colegios. It is not the cream of the crop. And I think there's a lot of sort of weird resentments there that are playing out now in terms of Bukele's relationship with other sectors of the ruling class, and also like their accumulation ambitions as a family. But that is just to say that Armando Bukele, interestingly, was sympathetic with the FMLN and had very close connections with especially the Communist Party faction of the FMLN, and specifically like Shafiq Handal, who was also Palestinian descent and was a guerrilla commander of the FMLN and in peacetime a really important leader of the party, right, who comes from that same faction. And so through those ties, the Bukele advertising agency or publicity company worked with the party. They developed these ties over time. Bukele, Nayib, when he was young, he started a career in law school and dropped out, and he ended up running a club.
Like a nightclub?
Like a nightclub, which you can kind of tell,
I mean, at least when he started out, he definitely had like the kind of like sleazy club producer vibe going.
Definitely, yeah. It's a look. He hasn't entirely lost it.
Yeah, but he has hair implants now, so it's a little easier for him.
That's true. Speaking of turcos. Yeah. So he ran a club. The club got shut down or closed. He ended up working in the family's advertising agency for some time. And at a certain point, basically his father said, all right, I'm putting you in politics.
How do we know that came directly from his dad? Like, or why do we think that?
These are rumors. These are stories that I've heard from people who would know, but I can't claim to say that, like, that's exactly, I wasn't there.
Yeah. But bare minimum, we can say he was like inspired by his father to enter politics.
Yes, very much so. And it's certainly the case that his father's death, I think, is actually really important to the overt authoritarian, like totally anti-democratic turn that we've seen. So what it meant is that Bukele, who did not, as I said, come up through the traditional party structures of the FMLN, was in a position, because of the importance of who his father was, right, and sort of like what all those financial ties and cultural ties meant. He was in a position to become and be approved to be a candidate for mayor of this small San Salvador suburb of Nuevo Cuscatlan. And Bukele, so I said that, he became sort of an important person in Salvadoran politics in 2017 when he's expelled from the party, but I should say that he was already drawing a lot of attention from that time because the FMLN, like I said, it's a traditional political party with traditional political party discipline. That means it has its colors, it has its messaging, it has its decision-making structures. And from the outset, Bukele did not run Nuevo Cuscatlan like an FMLN municipality. He ran it with the same, social programs that the FMLN was promoting, the literacy programs and whatnot. But he, from the outset, had a really aggressive personal branding strategy where he deployed his signature cyan, that sort of like baby blue color that we associate with him. He branded everything with a white N and in that blue circle, and it was like N for Nuevo Cuscatlan, but it was like definitely N for Nayib. And so from the outset, that generated some suspicions, especially from people like within the FMLN ranks, because it's like this person is clearly sort of positioning themselves apart from the FMLN. I don't want to say the FMLN had a brand, but Bukele definitely had a brand, and he was creating a personal brand, using very effective marketing techniques. And the thing is, because these techniques were so effective, Bukele's popularity increased to the extent that the party decided that it would be acceptable to and strategic to run him as mayor of the capital city of San Salvador in 2015, which they did, and he won very handily. And at the time, this was a pretty celebrated move because it was seen as injecting a lot of like much needed youth and energy and like social media savvy into a party of, that was led by this aging generation of former guerrilla commanders and really needed a little bit of a boost, right, to reconnect with like this urban young base, right?
And this is also kind of at the tail of the Mauricio Funes experiment. Like they had already tried to bring in kind of like a young, fresh party outsider to be a candidate within a party that is traditionally very like cultured by its militancy from a very young age.
Exactly. And remember, at the time, folks might not recall because everything is so colored by everything that's happened since, but at the time that was wildly successful. Funes left office with hugely high approval ratings, and Bukele was very much seen to be a potential next Funes, right? So he runs San Salvador in very much the same way as Nuevo Cuscatlan, with his own personal branding strategy, keeping his control of his image, right? And I think there were signs from the outset that he was not entirely in line with the FMLN political ideological project, but it was sort of like a tense but productive relationship when he was in office. I mean, they implemented FMLN social programs. There was a celebration of LGBTQ culture and sort of inclusion.
Animals, skaters, I remember a lot of those photo ops.
Absolutely. So sort of what you would expect from a left of center, a progressive political party in power. At the same time, there was a lot of public-private partnerships and like private sponsorship of different infrastructure projects and spaces in a way that is not typical, right, for FMLN governance. And so I think that closeness with the private sector was always kind of uncomfortable. It's also important to think about like Bukele's signature line, his slogan, right? Even from back then was always like, el dinero alcanza cuando nadie roba, right? There's enough money when nobody steals. That's not really a progressive like a call for redistribution, right? That's liberal at best, right? I think anyone left of center and familiar with the way wealth distribution and the control of the means of production works in a country like El Salvador or anywhere else would say that no, there probably isn't enough money, even if everybody stops stealing.
Do you feel like that kind of stuff is what led people to start talking about him as like a political outsider? I guess that made more sense when he was mayor, but he kept that slogan, right? Like when he decided to run for president. So despite all this stuff about coming from like a wealthy background, but not being quite a member of the established oligarchy or whatever, I feel like a lot of his shtick was kind of, I'm sticking it to the traditional political class and doing things different here.
I think that's right. And unfortunately, like the FMLN's expelling him from the party only played into that discourse, right?
Yeah, what happened there? Spill the tea.
Well, Bukele clearly wanted to be president. And there were a lot of people who wanted him to be the FMLN's presidential candidate. But the FMLN has a whole internal process for selecting a candidate, right? And it became increasingly clear as he continued to sort of like buck the party leadership in public and less than respectful ways. It became clear that he was not going to be the FMLN's presidential pick for the 2018 presidential elections to begin in the 2019 term, right? As those tensions grew, there was an incident in a city council meeting where he made a sexist remark to a female FMLN council member.
Do we know what it was?
He called her a witch. He called her a bruja, and he may or may not have like thrown an apple at her.
What?
Yeah, that was pretty bad.
Yeah,
it was pretty bad.
I think I heard about the name calling. I don't remember the fruit throwing.
Yeah, he said something like, llévese esta manzana a su casa.
Oh my God, like she's like the Wicked Witch in Snow White or something?
Yeah, it was pretty bad. And to be fair, and so this was sort of the culmination of a whole series of incidents. And so the party's ethics committee expelled him from the party. And so what that did is it made sure that he was certainly not going to be the FMLN's presidential candidate, but it also freed him up to run on his own. Now, in the end, it proved too late for him to organize his own and register his own political party in time for these 2019 elections. So what he did, and this is the thing about Bukele, is he's always been an opportunist. He joined with another opportunist faction called Ghana, which is the small right-wing party that had broken off of Arena, the principal right-wing party in the country. And he ran on their ticket in 2019 and won. And I think that sort of outsider discourse is certainly it was a critical part of his image, but I think the other really important part of what helped him get to power in 2019 and made his campaign and messaging resonate was this anti-corruption line, right? Which is the other sort of the important part of that slogan, that there's enough money when nobody steals, right? Throughout the whole period that the FMLN was in the presidency, the traditional right wing was running a very aggressive campaign with a lot of help from the U.S. Embassy and the private sector, a very, very aggressive campaign to paint the FMLN as hopelessly and outrageously corrupt. This is not to say that there was like no malfeasance under FMLN governance, right? But it was certainly rich coming from the people that had like literally
Saquitos just stuffed their pants with saquitos.
just totally been brazenly looting the state for 20 years. Yeah, the people who like privatized the banks to themselves.
The telecommunications company, whatever. Name your institution.
Exactly.
Though the Arena Party, which governed El Salvador for 20 years, from 1989 to 2009, has been plagued with many high-profile corruption scandals, the Saquitos incident may be the most iconic. In 2014, former President Francisco Flores, who you might remember from episode 1, declared before a fact-finding commission that no, there was no record of the $10 million emergency relief fund that he received from Taiwan following El Salvador's devastating 2001 earthquake. But in his defense, there wasn't anybody overseeing his use of the money. Flores, however, was quick to assure his audience that he'd personally made sure the $10 million eventually reached their intended destination. Quote, "I would often distribute aid in saquitos de dinero, little sacks of money," he claimed. And so, the term saquitos stuck, referencing those cheeky under-the-table kickbacks you share with your cheros in high places. Oh, and the privatization stuff that we were discussing, by the way, refers to the sweeping neoliberal reforms undertaken under Arena governments of the 1990s and early 2000s that put formerly state institutions into private sector hands. And yes, those hands were often the hands of Arena politicians again, or, those affiliated with them.
So that's just to say that this really aggressive campaign of destabilization against the FMLN, Bukele was able to very, very expertly, very deftly leverage it against both the left and the right and say, they're all corrupt. This whole political class is corrupt. And only I am above and outside of this corrupt political class, and sort of position himself as this like messianic, savior figure, right?
Yeah, where have we heard that before? So once in the presidency, how did his rhetoric start to change, right? So we're, coming in with this dark horse, I'm going to come and set things straight and fix up the country, to where we're at now, which is kind of like pretty brazenly a despot, right? Like pretty brazenly this hard, what is it called? Iron-fisted authoritarian man, right? Like that seems quite a jump, or is it not? Was that kind of always there? What happened? We saw already some changes, right, in his like political image from, becoming mayor of Nuevo Cuscatlán to running for president. But what happened once he actually got into the presidency with his ideology?
It is wild because folks may forget, but Bukele really did run as a progressive. He really did go to the National University and promise more funding and to defend the university's autonomy and promise to be a friend to the LGBTQ community and to continue,
we have receipts. We have receipts of all these things.
Indeed. And there are tweets.
Those are the receipts. Those are my favorite receipts. Yeah. Even if he deleted them, there are great screenshots all over the place of this stuff.
But of course, he did run with a very conservative right-wing party. And I think what we saw is that Bukele saw opportunities and seized them. I think that he learned a lot of lessons from watching the FMLN in power, one of the most important of which was the role of the legislature and the judicial power in undermining FMLN governments, right?
Yeah, it's kind of a key one, huh?
I mean, throughout both of the FMLN's terms, the right wing's blockade in the legislature was used to starve the government of funding. It was used to impose attorney generals who were antagonistic towards the executive branch. The right wing, the traditional right wing's hold on the judiciary, which has long been the case, and especially through the Supreme Court, was used also to advance these sort of bogus, trumped up corruption charges, but most importantly, to continuously block critical FMLN reforms, especially sort of the more transformative ones that might go against entrenched private sector interests. So they got to the point where the right-wing Supreme Court even declared bus lanes unconstitutional in El Salvador.
That was so bogus. It still makes me so mad every time I see the Citrans lane. It's still there, y'all. It's so sad.
Shocking. El Salvador is maybe the only country in Central America that doesn't have some kind of mass transit system with like bus lanes, and you can thank the right-wing Supreme Court for that.
Citrans was a rapid transit bus system that began service in 2015 with its own dedicated lane built down the Boulevard del Ejército and the Alameda Juan Pablo II in San Salvador, linking Soyapango to the El Salvador del Mundo monument in about 20 minutes. A tramo that normally takes 45 minutes to an hour and a half by car. The fare was 33 cents, the buses were air-conditioned, and all the stops were covered. It was glorious. But because it was an FMLN project, all sorts of conservative carholic forces got together to take it down. In 2017, El Salvador's Supreme Court drafted a temporary measure allowing cars to circulate in the Citram's once special little reserved bus lane, thus defeating its entire purpose. By 2019, the court decided it was unconstitutional for streets to have segregated lanes at all. Citram stopped running altogether in 2020 when all public transit was grounded during the COVID-19 lockdown. Its empty stations and bus lanes remain urban landmarks today, reminders of just how much the Salvadoran political and business class hates commuters.
Never forgive, never forget.
Indeed. And Bukele did not forget, because what he did in power is that, and I think things really came to a head under the COVID-19 pandemic. What we saw under COVID was Bukele used the crisis to kind of drum up a lot of fear, to militarize the country, and to declare his first state of exception. And it created this prolonged constitutional crisis that never got resolved until after the 2021 midterms, when his party won a legislative majority and they basically did a coup against the Supreme Court and the Attorney General. They illegally fired the Attorney General and the entire Constitutional Court and replaced them all totally illegally with loyalists, right? Bukele was increasingly coming up, right, against the limits of this delicate but, existing post-war democratic system, right, that had these sort of checks and balances in place, right, that we're all sort of familiar with. And he kept pushing the limits of them.
Do you think it was him just like trying stuff out, or did you feel like it was like a master plan type situation?
I'm not a partisan of the master plan discourse. There are people who attribute a lot of grand strategy to Bukele, and I mean, I might be wrong, but I don't really see it. I see a lot of improvisation. I see a lot of just reacting to conjunctures. And I think we can see that in some of the missteps and mistakes that Bukele has made, right?
Our infallible leader has been fallible.
Indeed. I mean, Bitcoin was massively unpopular, and he ended up having to roll back basically the entire thing to get an IMF deal. This whole Bitcoin bond, Bitcoin city bullshit that he put forward, it never happened.
Bitcoin Beach, baby. Inspired the show, honey.
Absolutely. The decision to reopen metals mining, I don't think that was always on the agenda. I think this is a cash-starved administration that is desperately reaching out to find income where it can. And I think we see that a lot in Bukele. I think if it had been possible for him to have a good relationship with a Democratic administration, I think he would have embraced it. And as that proved inconvenient, he bet on Trump. He made a gamble, and that played out. That was successful for him.
Very nicely.
Mm-hmm. But I don't think you could say that in 2019 he necessarily went into office with that plan.
I feel like the way that I have thought about his political transformation has very much also been kind of an indebtedness to his last-minute allies that he kind of was able to accumulate along the way, like these evangelical Christians and the sort of the outsider right wing in El Salvador. Am I making, does that sound right to you, or is this just kind of tangential?
I think that's really important. And also, the changing global climate, as this sort of insurgent right-wing force has consolidated internationally, both around crypto and in other sort of weird anarcho-capitalist spaces. Bukele has leaned into that and embraced it.
I hear he was always a crypto bro.
I think he definitely was, and I think his brother especially always was.
There's so many of them.
I think Karim, but I honestly I can't keep track of them all.
I seriously can. I mean, as you said,
There
there
might be another one.
Okay.
Yusef?
There's a bunch. Okay.
There are several.
So global changes have also influenced this guy and how he's like moved politically as a ruler.
Yeah, I think he astutely sort of saw this consolidating current and decided to lean into it. And I think that, which is not to say that the sort of inherent machismo of all of that wasn't always there. I think that's very organic to him. I don't think it's a show. I think it's very easily done.
Throwing an apple at someone and calling them a witch is pretty indicative, I gotta say.
Exactly. But I also do think that, like, if Armando Bukele were still around and the sort of global conditions were different, we might see a very different Nayib Bukele.
Like a Gavin Newsom.
It was literally what I was just thinking.
Oh, for real?
Absolutely.
I mean, as we're recording this podcast, the LA riots are happening right now because of ICE and whatnot, and I'm just like really disturbed by how heroic of a figure people are painting Newsom to be. And I'm like, I feel like you're just as skeezy. You're just doing well with the coyuntura, man.
Yeah. No Newsom fandom.
Okay, we've mentioned like a lot of different kinds of political currents, influences, etc. How would you describe Bukele's ideology if you had to?
It's so hard. I mean, now I think it's very clear that he advances this sort of like classic crypto bro tech fascist bullshit, right? I think that that's sort of a clear line. He falls into closer to the Peter Thiel category, with a hefty dose of social reaction as well to throw to the evangelical base,
Yeah, I think that's why it feels like confusing to me, right? Because allegedly these guys are also like, whatever Sam Friedman, whatever the fuck those people are called, they're like in polycules and like,
But it's all anything if incoherent. Well, wasn't Armando Bukele perhaps? I don't know. I don't think he would have characterized it that way. But I think that incoherence is, at least it's a familiar pattern at this point. It's like Javier Milei, it's a thing. It's like this weird, the socially conservative anarcho-capitalist. I think it's a pattern. I don't think that that's an ideology that he has always held, and it's hard to know how firm those convictions are. But I think that it's the perspective that he and his team, right? Because we have to remember that there's a whole sort of circle around him of far-right Venezuelan advisors and siblings and high school friends that are sort of crafting this message together. I think that's what they've decided to put forward. They decided that's who their allies are. That's what's strategic to promote at this time.
Can we talk about the team? I feel like that's maybe something that doesn't get talked about like that often because, he's done such a good job of being the messianic savior of El Salvador that we kind of forget that there's also obviously a group of people that he's specifically hired to tweak his public image and whatnot. So like, who are these people? When did they hop on? What are they doing? Do you think they have something to do with how much he's changed his rhetoric since he became mayor of San Salvador, for example?
Well, certainly I think like the key actors are his family. That, in El Salvador, a lot of people talk about like the clan Bukele, like the Bukele clan. And I think there's definitely a sort of a family project at play. We've seen a lot of really great investigative journalism coming out of Central America recently about how the Bukele family has acquired all these properties, including critically coffee plantations. They're like finally achieving the dream, right, of being cafetaleros.
Yeah, so if you don't like Bukele, don't buy Bean of Fire coffee because that is his whole thing.
It's also like $50 a pound.
Is it really?
Nobody's buying Bean of Fire.
I mean, I feel like if people are trying to be bougie, I mean, because El Salvador's coffee is like now kind of a thing, right? And so if you're trying to buy like an exclusive brand, like that would.
I think it's a promotional stunt. I've never seen anyone like at the airport purchase it.
I've seen people talking to those salespeople at the airport. That's as far as I've gotten.
Yikes. Yeah, no. Yeah, what do I know?
So they're buying up coffee plantations, tons of beachfront property.
Yeah, there's a huge land grab going on in El Salvador, and Bukele's family is very much a part of it. Although I think it would be a huge mistake to say that like that's what's driving this sort of like rentier accumulation pattern in the country. I think a lot of different interests. But so certainly first and foremost, we have the Bukele family as such. And this is part of this like ongoing project that I think Armando Bukele was very much an advocate of, trying to sort of position these factions. And in fact, the FMLN is very much guilty in facilitating that, because part of the FMLN strategy when they were in power was to try and weaken the oligarchy by creating more opportunities for precisely this class, this sector of the bourgeoisie, that is this non-oligarchic bourgeoisie, and providing more contracts to and business opportunities with sectors like the Bukele family as a way to sort of undermine the traditional oligarchy. And in empowering those sectors of capital, they also did a similar thing for politics. That's how the Ghana party, this right-wing party that Bukele ran as president with, exists in the first place. This faction split off from Arena, encouraged by the FMLN as a way to undermine and weaken Arena as a right-wing bloc.
I don't know the FMLN was cheering them on.
Interviews came out later that basically has the FMLN admitting that they were like really important in encouraging that split.
Wow, I did not know that.
Neither did I until it came out. Chalk it up to yet another one of the FMLN's strategies that were excellent in the short term, and in the long term, absolutely devastating for their political power. And so similarly, Bukele has been sort of empowering those factions, right, of capital, and because he represents them like personally. At the same time, there's this circle of Venezuelan advisors that I
want to know all about them.
I wish I could tell you more about them, but they're far right Venezuelans, dissidents from the anti-Chavistas, dissidents of Maduro, who have been brought in, I guess, as political consultants. And it's really not clear like what their roles are. Similar to like Bukele's brothers, who will like go on diplomatic missions. These are unelected. And as far as we know, they hold no formal offices in the Salvadoran government, and yet are representing the Salvadoran state, apparently, in some kind of official capacity. So the Venezuelan advisors, they were present in the Oval Office for the Trump meeting, at least one of them.
Oh, God.
Yeah. As was one of the U.S. lobbyists that Bukele has contracted. So he also has lobbyists in the States, which is not unusual per se, but it is kind of strange to bring them into the room. He had his entire comms team in the Oval Office with him. Yeah, and like not his vice president.
I feel like they just kind of bust out Ulloa when Bukele is like too busy to answer people. I feel like he's not the media spotlight ever. People forget who he is constantly.
Like really humiliating. But so there's the comms people, the contractors, the Venezuelans, and then of course there's this sort of group of high school friends, folks he studied at the Panamericana with, Ernesto Castro, right, the president of the Legislative Assembly. People that Bukele sort of grew up with and has brought along with him. But it's a very tight, very closed circle, very hermetically sealed. There's all kinds of rumors always swirling about like Bukele's health, about, Bukele's personal relationships. But we really don't know very much. Bukele doesn't actually go out in public very often. He doesn't address the public very often. When he does, it's in very, very choreographed, highly mediatized spectacles. And so it's hard to actually have a clear idea of what's going on in those spaces.
It's interesting, right? Because he also has this family man persona, right? And that seems...
Traditional family.
Yes.
Important.
It seems really, really critical to who he is as a politician. So where do you think the line is between shoving his daughters and his wife in front of the camera versus like not letting anybody know a damn thing about how he lives? And sometimes he like lets stuff slip, like that like really creepy tweet he made when he closed the Instituto de Bienestar Animal about like, I can't deal with this, I only get 2 hours of sleep at night. And it's like, oh.
He said he was reading 8,000, he had read 8,000 tweets. That was, I mean.
Like, dude, you just seem just like, maybe this is why he's so hermetic, because these little glimpses of his like actual like who I am as a person are just terrifying. He just seems like manic all the time,
There's a lot of like hints of, potential substance abuse. No, it's hard to know, but certainly that sort of traditional heteropatriarchal family values is really important. His wife has very, I must say, conveniently timed her pregnancies for presidential campaigns.
Every time he's run for something, she's been pregnant.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
For president specifically, actually.
That's
yes.
right. Yeah.
Can you talk about this particular term, right? Because, he's been in power 6-7 years now at this point. What can we expect? We've already seen, I think, kind of a vibe shift from when his second inauguration happened last year. But what are you thinking in terms of now that he has all of his people in place, these like really powerful international allies like Trump and Milei or whatever the fuck, probably Musk. I think they like
I
each
wouldn't
other.
put Trump and Milei on the same level. Giving Milei a lot of credit there.
No, it's true, but at least he has guys cheering him on that have power to some degree or whatever, and Marco Rubio, whatever the fuck. So yeah, what can we expect from this particular phase of him being in power?
Well, far be it for me to say what to expect, because what we've seen from Bukele is like I said, a lot of reaction and improvisation. So it's hard to say what's going to come next. I think what we're seeing a lot of. We're starting to see, in some ways, the walls closing in around Bukele in a certain way. I think the state of exception proved to be, rather, I should say, Bukele was early on in his first term starting to lose popularity, especially over the Bitcoin thing. And we saw massive marches, not just against Bitcoin, but in defense of the peace accords in 2021, in September 2021.
Because he didn't want those celebrated.
No, he rejects them. He called them a farce, and he halted any kind of government commemorations, right?
That's another one of his like funny shticks is like, I'm the beginning of real Salvadoran history. Like nothing mattered.
The post-war ends with me, which I think is true in some ways.
Not for the reasons that he thinks, but...
So that's just to say that in March of 2022, when Bukele enacts the state of exception, his approval ratings were starting to flag. Like there was certain amount of desgaste, right, of sort of like wear and tear of his allegedly legendary, favorability ratings, right? I think it's really important that people like take all those poll numbers with a hefty grain of salt.
Oh, tell me why.
Well, because they're the government contracts these polls. So,
are those the only polls that we're getting information from, do we know?
No, but those the ones that Bukele puts out there when we talk about figures in the 90s, those are government contracted polls. So this is just to say that when the state of exception went into effect, Bukele's popularity was starting to flag, and it was this blow that was struck to the sort of day-to-day street level of crime and extortion and gang violence that people, in working class communities all over the country experience, that was able to revive, right, his figure and give him this boost necessary to bring him through the 2024 elections. The 2024 elections that were held under a state of exception with all kinds of last-minute electoral reforms and really radical gerrymandering.
They lost some boxes. It was a shit show.
It was a real mess.
I've observed a few Salvadoran elections. That was by far and away the messiest ones I've ever seen.
I can say the same. And to say nothing of the fact that, of course, his re-election was totally unconstitutional.
As Hilary mentions, the 2024 elections were marked by some busted last-minute reforms and a widespread sprinkling of vote tampering, all taking place under heavy gerrymandering and an illegal second presidential run by Nayib. Now, if that was a mouthful for you, don't worry, I'll break it down. It would take too long to explain all the irregularities of the 2024 elections, but I'll share some of the highlights. A poll staffing lottery was implemented for the first time to run the polling stations, similar to being called up for jury duty. What this meant was that a lot of people simply didn't show up to run the voting centers, leaving them extremely understaffed. Conveniently, in some of these cases, randos would sometimes show up to fill this need. Another important last-minute reform was the implementation of a brand new wireless voting transmission system that was supposed to be used at each voting booth. Now, if you've spent a lot of time in El Salvador, you might see the issue here with getting electricity, much less Wi-Fi, to work consistently in some of these rural or even urban polling places. Even booths with a steady internet connection saw widespread system failures, leaving the volunteer poll workers to tally votes by hand, sometimes working until 4 a.m. to do so. Then, there's the issue of the ballot boxes. There were a ton of pictures floating around online of what were supposed to be sealed boxes full of votes arriving at the main processing center, looking like they'd clearly been taped back together. I saw a few of these in person myself. And finally, there's the gerrymandering that Hilary hinted at. Just before the elections, El Salvador's 262 townships got reduced to just 44, creating administrative chaos as well as a much simpler way for all cities to get a Nuevas Ideas mayor. Added to this, they switched up the algorithm for electing representatives to the Legislative Assembly. Under previous elections, the number of votes that opposition parties received in 2024 would have added a few more non-Nuevas Ideas legislators to the Salón Azul. Currently, however, there are only 3 opposition seats out of 60 possible legislators in the Assembly, 2 from Arena and Claudia Ortiz from Vamos, even though the FMLN and Gana parties actually received significantly more votes than Claudia in the 2024 election. So, now, basically, we are a one-party system. As for the illegal presidential run, the Salvadoran constitution prohibited presidents from running for 2 consecutive terms. Nayib decided in 2024, though, that this simply didn't apply to him. Don't worry, this won't be an issue again, since the Legislative Assembly has now made it much, much easier to amend the Constitution and has taken full advantage of this fact to announce in July that their constitutional reforms now allow for indefinite re-election.
All of that said, despite these really dubious conditions under which the vote was held, he did win more votes. More people did vote for Bukele, and that's genuinely because of the popular reaction to this blow that appeared to be struck, against organized crime. However, even in those elections, it was clear that there's a huge gap between the votes that Bukele got as president and the votes that his legislators and his mayors got. His party is far less popular than he is as a person. And in fact, had he not rewritten the rules of the game, opposition parties like the FMLN would have actually increased their share of representation in the legislature instead of what actually happened, which is that they lost all seats in the legislature because of this insane gerrymandering.
Is there any opposition in legislature right now?
There's at least one. folks will fact check me. There may be more than one. I'm thinking of Claudia Ortiz. Yeah. There may be.
And I think one FMLN person.
No, they lost all seats. It's crazy. And even though they actually secured more votes than last time. That's just to say that Bukele's popularity is relative, right? It's contingent, and I think it's pretty shallow. And what we've seen in the second term, he comes in with a mandate that he insisted strengthened, but I would say is actually somewhat weakened in terms of the support that his single-party state project has. And over the course of the second term, what we're seeing is the inability to deliver on anything beyond the promises of, mass incarceration and iron fist policing. And so rather than delivering on campaign promises of these massive infrastructure projects, what we're seeing is mass displacement. We're seeing, dispossession of rural communities, street vendors, these huge land grabs, right? Mega projects, but mostly for the private sector. And none of sort of the big promises, and much less of an economic miracle, right, that Bukele was promising. But we're also starting to see creeping discontent with the fact that, sure, people appreciate the fact that they're not being shaken down by gang members every day, and that's no small thing, but as time goes by, people have material needs that are not getting met. The economic crisis is really serious, and Bukele is increasingly transparent in his political persecution, in his deployment of the state of exception against the poor, against social movements, against lawyers, against human rights defenders. And so I think that his popularity will continue to wear thin. I think he's going to have a real hard time to rally it. And I think he has increasingly fewer tools at his disposal with which to do so. But that just means that rather than continuing to try and govern by consent, he'll double down on coercion.
This is thinking back a little bit to his political trajectory and him presenting himself as an outsider candidate, but also, I was talking to you before we started recording, kind of as a reluctant politician. Do you think he still feels that way, or do you think he's enjoying being president?
I try not to do too much armchair psychologizing of Bukele because I do not know what's going on there. I could not say. But I do get the impression that he is increasingly isolated from public opinion, despite all of his, consultants and media apparatus. I do think that he is increasingly cut off and caught up in his own image as this sort of like all-powerful and infallible figure. And that's sort of a scary thought, mostly because it may well be, as I said, that his popularity will continue to thin out, but there are increasingly few institutional legal channels with which to challenge him.
Are there any?
I mean, not really. Not really. The political opposition parties that do exist have been reduced to scraps, and the spaces to, register new political parties are null. And because of the gerrymandering, there's basically no means by which minority representation can like thrive at the territorial level. So it's quite a predicament.
Yeah, I would say so. Well, thank you so much for telling us about Latin America's coolest dictator. Do you have any final thoughts about our Twitter-addicted messiah?
I don't know. I'm sure there's so much more to say.
We covered a lot of ground, I gotta say. Maybe the one thing that we didn't talk about, if you have any thoughts on this, which is the kind of the really obvious thing on paper that people bring up like constantly, is the Arab Muslim thing. And all of a sudden he's this very devout evangelical Christian. So what the heck happened there with religion, and what part does it maybe play with where we're at right now?
That's a great question. I mean, it's very strange, like I said, given his background, like this Palestinian Christian family, but
Muslim converts.
And he grew up in a Muslim household.
Right. His name is Nayib.
His name is Nayib. He was always very coy about that, though, even from the outset. I think there's a lot of Islamophobia in El Salvador. I think that's really important. And actually, you'll see kind of the opposition toying with some racist tropes that I think are not helpful. It's certainly notable, though, that when he was mayor of San Salvador, he went to he went to Israel. He went to the Wall. He did sort of like the standard U.S. politician tour, in a way that I think most Palestinians would find shocking and offensive.
And yeah, he's like buddies with the Palestinian ambassador. We have a Palestinian embassy, which is kind of weird, I think, for a lot of places.
Thanks to FMLN. Mm-hmm. But he has made a point of really embracing the sort of like evangelical Zionist discourse. I think it's politically strategic for him, and that's all. I don't think he's a religious person, at least not in such a way that he had any qualms about suppressing his Islamic identity from a very early stage of his political career. And I think that was a strategic move, in a Christian majority country. I think less significant than his Islamic background is his class background and his ethnic background in terms of situating with him within this sort of like block of the Turcos, because I think that explains more about his relationship to the traditional oligarchy, as well as his family's relationship with the FMLN and sort of like how they came to be positioned for this power grab.
So, even though they came from a lot of money, they still can think about themselves as, the outsiders, the like marginalized sectors of Salvadoran society.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a yearbook photo of Nayib from the Panamericana where he he was named class terrorist, as though that was some kind of like hilarious joke. So you can see the kind of racism.
What year did he graduate in?
Oh, that's a great question.
Probably like, he's
like 44.
Yeah, so maybe probably pretty close to September 11th. I'm guessing. Yeah, probably around like 2002 or something, 2003. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I still hear people refer to him as ese árabe, to like, disparagingly or in any other kind of way. I don't know if you remember like the first time he got elected, people were like going to the polls and like burqas and shit like that, and like brought like pictures of camels and stuff, like it's I would love to do a whole episode around like race in El Salvador, but I feel even if obviously his ethnicity matters to him, right? He named his daughters Layla and Amina. These are not Salvadoran names, but it's not something he like particularly foregrounds. But people don't forget it, though. People don't forget it at all.
No, they don't. I think it does play an interesting role, but I think it also goes to show that like whatever that racism is, it clearly wasn't sufficient to like jeopardize his chances as a politician in the country. I mean, El Salvador has had how many, Arab descended presidents? They've had several. Saka, at the very least. I had an ex-boyfriend whose mother was Lebanese, and she could rattle off the names of all the Latin American countries that have had Lebanese presidents, and it's most of them.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, that makes sense. What a fun thing to collect.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I guess they should start thinking about all the countries that have had Salvadoran presidents.
It's a nice list.
It's just one. It's just the one country. Thank you so much, Hilary, for talking to us about our favorite member of the Palestinian diaspora, Nayib Bukele, and appreciate you being on the show.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in, surfers. Be sure to follow Hilldog on X as Hilary Goodfriend, no D at the end, and check out her work in Jacobin, NACLA, Latin American Perspectives, and much more. Drop back in a couple of weeks if you've been wondering what's happened to some of the homies that have broken stories like the ones in this episode, and why so many of them have decided to go look for new jobs overseas lately. That's right. Next time we'll be discussing freedom of the press in El Salvador. Our theme music is thanks to the talents of Paco Casanova, George Fierro, and Guille. Salud!